The smell hit Sylvia before she even stepped fully into the kitchen. Not the warm, rich aroma of rosemary and garlic that had filled the house all afternoon, but something sharper: grease, salt, the heavy, unmistakable scent of pepperoni. Her heart dropped as she turned the corner and saw them. Greasy cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly on the counter, the bold red logo of the local pizza chain glaring back at her like an accusation. She stood there, frozen, still clutching the serving spoon she had carried in from the dining room. The spoon, still warm from stirring her slow-roasted lamb, felt absurd in her hand now, like a relic from a different evening. The soft clatter of plates and casual chatter buzzed behind her as her family gathered around the boxes, laughing, pulling open lids to reveal glistening slices already oozing with congealed cheese. Her daughter, Melissa, looked up briefly and offered a light chuckle. "We thought you'd want a break today, Mom." Her voice was airy, like she was doing Sylvia a favor. "No need for all that cooking fuss on your birthday." Sylvia's eyes flicked toward the dining table she had spent hours preparing. The roasted lamb, glistening and perfectly tender, sat untouched on the silver platter she had polished that morning. The garlic mashed potatoes she had whipped by hand, smoothing out every lump with care, cooled steadily beneath the linen cover. The sourdough bread, which had taken her 2 days to ferment and rise just right, rested in its basket like a forgotten offering. The butter she had softened to room temperature was still perfectly spreadable, though no one reached for it. No candles. No thank yous. Not even a passing glance at the meal that had filled her small kitchen with warmth and purpose since the early morning. She could still smell faint hints of the garlic and rosemary lingering beneath the heavy blanket of cheap takeout, but it was fading fast, overtaken by the greasy weight of processed cheese. Her throat tightened as she tried to swallow, but it caught halfway down. She forced a small smile, the muscles in her face straining to hold it in place. "I thought I'd surprise everyone," she managed, her voice thinner than she intended. "Oh, that's sweet, Mom," Melissa replied absently, already pulling slices onto paper plates for her kids. "But we figured you'd want to relax. Today, you do so much. It's your birthday, after all." Sylvia stood there, rooted in place, watching her grandchildren giggle and fight over slices, the crinkling of napkins and rustling of pizza boxes filling the space where gratitude should have lived. Her husband barely glanced up from his phone, mumbling something about the game starting soon. The serving spoon trembled slightly in her hand, but she gripped it tighter, as if the simple act of holding it might preserve some shred of her dignity. The house she had filled for decades with the smell of home-cooked meals, with birthday cakes, and Sunday roasts, with recipes passed down from her mother and perfected over years of love and labor, now smelled like a cheap takeout joint. And somehow, they thought they were doing her a favor. Sylvia didn't move. She simply stood there, watching them eat, the weight of years folding in on her like a slow, invisible collapse. The kitchen had always been her sanctuary. Sylvia, younger, then would hum softly as she stirred thick, bubbling stews, the melody mixing with the hiss of onions caramelizing in butter. Her apron, always slightly too big, carried permanent flour stains across the front, each one a badge earned from years of kneading dough and rolling out pie crusts. The windows would fog up in winter, steam curling from the pots and pans as her children ran through the house, the scent of cinnamon or roasted chicken wrapping itself around them like a warm embrace. She worked full-time back then. The early morning rush to pack lunches, tie shoelaces, and make it to the office on time. A quick stop at the market after work, then home again, where dinner waited to be made. It never occurred to her to cut corners. Meals weren't just fuel, they were the rhythm of their lives. Roast chicken on Sundays, spaghetti on Mondays, pot, roast on Wednesdays, always with fresh bread or rolls she started before sunrise. She fed them consistency, stability, and love, plated carefully every evening. Even when exhaustion tugged at her, she kept going. Through the flu, she stood at the stove, wiping her brow between stirring. Through pregnancies, grief, and loss, after her own mother's funeral, she came home and baked a pie because the kids would expect dessert. She cooked through everything, always present, always steady. Birthdays were her favorite. She made elaborate cakes shaped like dinosaurs, princess castles, or football fields, depending on the child. She decorated with tiny piping bags, staying up late to perfect each detail. She never forgot anyone's favorite flavor, who liked extra frosting or who didn't want sprinkles. On those days, their laughter filled the kitchen, frosting smudged on their cheeks as they blew out candles under her watchful, beaming eyes. But her own birthday always passed differently. "Don't worry about me," she would say each year. "I'm just happy we're together." And she meant it. Seeing her family together, full and happy, was enough. The simple joy of watching them eat the meal she had poured herself into was her celebration. The children grew older, but the traditions remained. Even as they moved out and started families of their own, she continued to host, to plan, to cook. Holidays meant turkeys roasted to golden perfection, hams glazed with brown sugar and cloves, casseroles bubbling beneath browned cheese. Even when arthritis stiffened her fingers, she kneaded dough slowly, patiently, adjusting to the aches without complaint. The meals were more than recipes. They were her way of anchoring the family, of reminding them that no matter how busy or scattered their lives became, home was still here. Still warm, still hers to provide. She never spoke of how tired she sometimes felt or how heavy the grocery bags had grown over the years. She didn't mention how long she stood on aching feet or how lonely it sometimes was to cook for hours before anyone arrived. She wore her weariness like an invisible garment, hidden beneath the aroma of roasting garlic and simmering herbs. She believed deeply that love meant giving, and she gave everything. The conversation wasn't meant for her ears. Sylvia had only come back inside to grab her reading glasses from the side table. But as she approached the hallway leading to the living room, she heard the voices, low, casual, too comfortable in their dismissal of her. She stopped just short of the corner, the voices belonging to her daughter-in-law, Vanessa, and her oldest son, Mark. Their words drifted through the half-closed door like tiny blades. "I know she means well," Vanessa sighed, her voice light but laced with irritation. "But she just clutters the kitchen. It's exhausting trying to work around her." Mark's response came with an uneasy chuckle. "She's always been that way, trying to take over everything." Vanessa lowered her voice, but the words still cut through. "Honestly, no one even likes her food anymore. It's just old-fashioned. Heavy, you know? Too much butter and salt. The kids barely touch it. They'd rather have something simple, something healthier." Mark exhaled. "Yeah, it might be time. We're not kids anymore. Things are different." Sylvia stood frozen, her back pressed lightly against the wall, her reading glasses hanging uselessly from her hand. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick, lingering, impossible to unhear. No one likes her food anymore. Old-fashioned, she retreated quietly back down the hallway, each step carefully placed so the creaking floorboards wouldn't give her away. The warmth of the house seemed to dim as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom. She closed the door softly behind her and sat on the edge of the bed, the hum of distant conversation still faint beneath her floorboards. Later that evening, as they all sat around the living room, the tension that only she seemed to feel crackled beneath the surface. The grandchildren were sprawled on the carpet, watching a movie, while the adults chatted idly about summer plans and school schedules. That's when Mark cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Vanessa before turning toward Sylvia. "Mom," he began, with the same cautious tone one might use when approaching a wild animal, "we were actually thinking—" His voice trailed off for a moment, as if hoping she might fill in the gap and spare him the discomfort. When she didn't, he continued, "You've done so much for us over the years, all the meals, all the Sundays. But now that everyone's Older and busier, we thought. Maybe it would be easier if we just ordered in for Sunday dinners. He smiled as though he was doing her a kindness. You wouldn't have to go through all the trouble anymore. Just come, sit, relax, no pressure. Sylvia's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. Her pulse throbbed softly in her ears. So, you don't want me to cook anymore? Her voice was steady, but she felt the ground shifting beneath her words. Mark hesitated, looking for support from Vanessa, who quickly chimed in. It's not that we don't appreciate it. It's just, we've moved into a new routine. It's easier. And everyone agreed. Everyone agreed. A polite vote. A quiet decision made without her. The Sunday roasts, the carefully prepared meals she had poured her heart into for decades, were no longer welcome. They weren't just asking her to rest. They were replacing her. Sylvia swallowed hard, managing a small nod as she forced a tight smile onto her face. Of course, she said softly, whatever works best for everyone. The conversation drifted back to lighter topics, but Sylvia sat there, barely hearing any of it. Her chest tightened, but she kept her face still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She stayed until the evening wrapped up, exchanging hugs, kissing the grandchildren goodnight, wishing them all a safe drive home. Only when the house finally fell silent did she let her face collapse. She climbed into bed, turned off the lamp, and let the darkness swallow the hot tears that spilled freely now. Behind the closed door, her sobs came in small, muffled waves, each one sharp, as if something inside her had finally cracked. It wasn't just the food, it was her. She wasn't needed anymore. And somehow, being dismissed with such softness, such quiet finality, made it hurt even more. The holidays came and went like distant storms, loud somewhere else, but only a faint rumble where Sylvia sat. She decorated the house as she always had, out of habit, more than hope. The wreath hung on the front door, the garland draped across the mantel, the same ornaments carefully unwrapped and placed on the artificial tree she had used for years. But the house felt colder now, the silence thicker than ever before. She called Mark on Christmas Eve to ask if they might stop by, even for a short visit. The call rang and rang before sliding into voicemail. She tried Melissa's number next, straight to voicemail again. She left polite messages, soft, cheerful, understanding. I know you're busy, sweetheart. Just wanted to wish everyone a Merry Christmas. Love you. The words hung in the empty air after she said them, landing nowhere. On Christmas morning, the house was still. She sat alone at the kitchen table, stirring cream into her coffee as snow drifted quietly outside the window. The gift she had wrapped for Sophie, a book she thought her granddaughter would love, sat unopened on the corner of the table. They hadn't come by to pick it up. They hadn't even asked if she had prepared anything. Her phone buzzed once, that afternoon. A simple text from her grandson. Hey Nana, can you Venmo me $50? Need to get a gift for Mom. Thanks. No Merry Christmas. No, how are you? Just a request. A transaction. She stared at the message for a long while before finally opening the app and sending the money, replying with a short, "Of course, sweetheart, Merry Christmas." And that was it. The house she once filled with laughter, with meals that took days to prepare, with handmade centerpieces and carefully folded napkins, was now just a quiet container of empty spaces. The family photos lining the hallway stared back at her as she moved from room to room. Smiling faces, captured in warm moments long past, now felt distant, like portraits of strangers she barely recognized. In the kitchen, her tools sat untouched. The cast-iron Dutch oven that had seen decades of roasts, the rolling pin her mother once used, the worn wooden spoons with handles darkened by years of use. They rested neatly in drawers and on hooks, waiting for a meal that would never be prepared. She ran her hand gently along the countertop, feeling the cool, smooth surface beneath her fingers, remembering how often it used to be dusted with flour or lined with baking trays. Now, even the appliances seemed to hum less, like the house itself had grown weary of waiting. On Sundays, she still set an extra place at the table, unable to stop the ritual that had been part of her life for so long. She would plate a simple meal, sometimes just soup, sometimes a roast smaller than before, and sit alone, eating in silence. The empty chairs across from her never lost their weight. Even as she grew used to the stillness, it never stopped. Pressing against her chest, she tried calling occasionally, but the calls were met with excuses. "Oh, sorry, Mom. We're just about to sit down to dinner. I'll call you tomorrow." But tomorrow rarely came. Melissa once answered and said, "Can we talk later? I'm running into a meeting." The call lasted less than a minute. After a while, Sylvia stopped calling altogether. She didn't want to be a burden. Her friends had dwindled too. Some passed away, some moved closer to their own children, others lost in their own quiet versions of the same loneliness. The occasional check-ins from old neighbors or distant cousins became more rare, their well-meaning voices filled with the same emptiness. "We should get together sometime." But the get-togethers never came. The house, once alive with motion and voices and laughter, now pulsed only with the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway and the occasional gust of wind against the windows. The air felt heavier in the winter, the rooms colder. And yet, Sylvia kept everything clean, orderly, prepared, as if someone might knock on the door any moment, though she knew deep down they wouldn't. Her love had always been in the service she gave. The meals, the holidays, the birthdays, all carefully tended, all offered without expectation. But once she no longer served, she vanished from their lives like a forgotten tradition. The late afternoon light streamed in through the kitchen windows as Sylvia sat at the dining table, surrounded by piles of old papers and manila folders. She had decided, somewhat aimlessly, to finally sort through the cabinets and drawers where decades of receipts, documents, and memories had quietly accumulated. The task had started as a distraction from the silence, but quickly became something more, a slow excavation of the life she had built. Her fingers moved carefully through the brittle pages, scanning utility bills from decades ago, birth certificates, faded photographs, and old warranties for appliances long gone. Then, tucked inside a yellowed envelope at the very bottom of the stack, she noticed something unfamiliar. The handwriting on the front was instantly recognizable. Her husband Richard's steady, deliberate script. Her heart tightened as she unfolded the letter. The scent of old paper mixing with the faint aroma of lavender that still lingered faintly in the house. "My dearest Sylvia," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it likely means you're sorting through things, organizing, like you always do. I wanted you to find this when the time was right, when you might need a reminder of what you've built. Remember that second property we invested in, the little rental on Oakview? I had it legally put in your name years ago, free and clear. I never wanted you to feel like you didn't have something of your own, something no one could ever take from you. You always gave everything to us, to the kids, to this home. But this is yours. A small piece of security, a small piece of independence. You've carried this family with your bare hands, Sylvia. Don't ever forget how strong you are." Tears welled in her eyes as she read, but they weren't the helpless kind that had so often visited her in the dark these past months. These tears were warm, grounding. She carefully set the letter down and opened the attached folder tucked behind it. Inside was the original land deed to the Oakview property, signed, notarized, entirely in her name. She had nearly forgotten about that house. It had been a quiet investment Richard pushed for, a modest rental unit that had practically managed itself for years with a steady, long-term tenant. She never paid it much attention. The checks had simply arrived each month, deposited automatically into the account Richard once managed. But now, seeing the deed in front of her, something shifted inside her chest. It was more than a house. It was proof. Proof that she still had something. Proof that she wasn't entirely at the mercy of others' decisions. As she sat, letting the weight of that realization settle into her bones, her eyes drifted toward the far corner of the kitchen, where a battered leather-bound journal peeked, out from a forgotten shelf. She reached for it instinctively, wiping a thin layer of dust from the cover. It was her recipe journal, the one she had kept since her early 20s. Every page was filled with handwritten notes, stained with years of cooking, the margins crowded with measurements, adjustments, tiny personal secrets to perfecting each dish. Flipping through the pages, she saw her entire life written in sauces and spices, the rosemary-crusted lamb she made every Easter, the sourdough starter she had nurtured like a child for years, the cranberry upside-down cake that only she could seem to get right. Each dish was more than a recipe. It was a piece of her, carefully crafted and refined through decades of love and labor. These recipes, these dishes, no one else in the family knew them the way she did. They hadn't cared to learn, dismissing them as old-fashioned, heavy, or unnecessary. But to Sylvia, they were living proof of her creativity, her resourcefulness, her quiet artistry. She hadn't simply fed them. She had created something beautiful. As she traced her fingers over the ink-stained pages, a slow but steady warmth spread through her. She had lost much, their presence, their attention, their appreciation. But she had not lost herself. She still carried her husband's trust, her own skill, her independence. She still had something left, not just in property or money, but in legacy. The silence that had haunted her for months no longer felt quite as suffocating. It was stillness, yes, but also space. Space she could now fill, not with grief, but with something new. She exhaled deeply, gently closing the journal and setting it beside the deed. For the first time in a long while, she felt the faint but undeniable stirrings of her own power, like embers flickering softly beneath long, cold ashes. There was still more of her story to write. The attorney's office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, a comforting scent that reminded Sylvia of the library where she used to take her children when they were small. She sat across from Mr. Abrams, a quiet, efficient man who reviewed her documents with deliberate care. His pen moved smoothly across the pages as they worked through the updates together. Each signature, each initial, felt like a small reclamation, a steady tightening of the threads she had allowed to fray for far too long. This will supersede the previous version entirely, Mr. Abrams explained gently, sliding the final document toward her. The property, financial accounts, and the Oakview house will be transferred according to your new instructions. Your children will not have legal claim. Sylvia nodded, her hand steady as she signed. That's what I want. And the publishing rights? He asked, glancing at the separate file she had brought. Yes, she said, her voice calm. The royalties and future earnings will be handled through the literary trust. Weeks earlier, she had walked into the small publishing house downtown, the manuscript cradled carefully in her arms like a fragile newborn. The receptionist, a kind young woman with bright eyes, had smiled when Sylvia introduced herself. It's a cookbook, she had explained, but also stories. She had felt a strange nervousness, but also a quiet pride. When the editor, a woman named Karen, who couldn't have been more than 40, flipped through the pages, she smiled warmly. These aren't just recipes, this is a life. The manuscript held decades of meals, handwritten notes and reflections, stories of birthdays, anniversaries, illnesses, soothed with broth, holidays built around roast lamb and sourdough. But unlike most cookbooks, it wasn't dedicated to her family. The title page read simply, "To the women who fed generations and were never fed in return." Karen had looked up from the manuscript and said softly, "You know, there are a lot of women who are going to see themselves in this." Sylvia smiled. "That's why I wrote it. Now, sitting across from Mr. Abrams, she felt no need to explain herself further. Her choices were no longer requests for understanding. They were decisions, quiet, final, hers. The most delicate part of the plan had been selling her half of the house, the one she still legally co-owned with Mark after Richard's passing, though her family had long assumed full control. She hadn't told them when she met with the real estate agent. She hadn't told them when she negotiated the buyout with the investment firm that now owned partial stakes in neighborhood properties. She signed the paperwork quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. The transfer was complete within weeks, the funds deposited into accounts she controlled entirely. Her children wouldn't discover the change until much later, when they would realize the asset they counted on had quietly slipped through their fingers. But Sylvia didn't do it out of spite. She did it because it was hers to do. The house had never been the true loss. The real wound had come from their slow abandonment, their dismissals disguised as concern, their quiet erasure of everything she had given. She no longer needed to demand their respect or beg for their attention. She had found something better, freedom from needing either. As she left Mr. Abrams' office, the weight in her chest felt lighter than it had in years. The cool breeze outside brushed against her face, but instead of making her feel small, it made her feel awake. She stopped by the small cafe on the corner, ordering her usual tea, and found a table by the window. The city moved around her. Cars passing, people chatting on sidewalks, couples laughing over pastries. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't watching the world move without her. She was a part of it again, not as a mother, not as a cook, not as someone waiting to be invited back into their lives, but as herself. She didn't need to raise her voice to win. She didn't need to argue or explain. She had simply chosen a different path. One they wouldn't see coming until long after she had already walked it. The phone buzzed in her purse. Another message from Melissa, likely another casual request disguised as small talk. Sylvia let it vibrate, untouched, as she sipped her tea, the warm steam rising gently into the afternoon air. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, crisp, official, impossible to ignore. Mark found it first, flipping through the stack of mail as he stood by the kitchen counter of the house he had long considered his own. The heavy envelope bore the name of the investment firm, now listed as co-owner. His brow furrowed as he tore it open, scanning the legal jargon, his stomach sinking with every line. By the time he reached the final paragraph, the color had drained from his face. Effective immediately, full ownership of the property will transfer to the purchasing entity. Arrangements will be made with current occupants regarding residency status following sale completion. He read it again, slower this time, as if that might change the words. But they remained, cold and clear. Sylvia had sold her share, without a word, without their consent, without even a warning. The phone calls began almost immediately. First Melissa, then Vanessa, then finally Mark himself, all dialing her number in rapid succession. Sylvia watched the screen light up again and again from where she sat in her small apartment, the late afternoon sun casting soft golden beams across her kitchen table. She let each call ring until it fell silent, one after the next. They kept calling. Finally, as evening approached, she answered. Her voice was calm. "Hello, Mark." "Mom?" he began, his voice tight, too rushed to hide the panic beneath it. "What the hell is going on? We just got notice you sold the house." "That's correct," she replied softly. "You didn't even talk to us. This affects all of us. This was the family house." Sylvia's lips curved into the faintest smile, though her voice never wavered from its steady rhythm. "It was the house your father and I built, and the share I owned was never yours to assume." Melissa's voice cut in from the speakerphone, sharp and incredulous. "Mom, we thought we agreed years ago that this was staying in the family. We've put money into repairs, into maintenance." "You made those choices," Sylvia interrupted, still quiet, still composed. You never consulted me then. The phone went silent for a moment before Mark's voice returned, this time clipped and colder. You can't just take everything back like this. Sylvia leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window at the soft pink hues streaking across the evening sky. I didn't take anything back, she said. It was always mine to decide. There was a beat of silence, and then Melissa's voice came again, brittle. So what now? You've sold the house, you've emptied the trust. What's left, Mom? What's left for us? Sylvia exhaled slowly, her voice lowering to something even more resolute, almost tender in its finality. For 40 years I fed you. I fed all of you. Your bodies, your birthdays, your holidays, your children. And when I stopped cooking, you stopped calling, she paused, letting the words settle like soft thunder. Now I'll feed myself. Neither Mark nor Melissa seemed to know how to respond. She could hear the shallow breathing through the phone, the weight of words they never expected to hear from her. For so long, they had assumed her role was fixed, permanent, like a well-worn chair they could pull out when convenient and leave empty when not. But Sylvia had outgrown that role. She had quietly, methodically rewritten the ending they had scripted for her. I don't want to fight, she added, her voice still steady. I just don't owe you any more of myself. With that, she ended the call, placing the phone face down, on the table. The room was still, filled only by the faint hum of the evening breeze drifting through the open window. Her funds were secure now. The book was moving toward publication. The apartment was hers, small, simple, but filled only with things she loved. The recipes that once bound her to them now belonged to her own hands, her own pages, her own readers. She poured herself a glass of wine, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. There was no rage inside her, no bitterness, only peace. They had taken her love for granted for decades, but they would never again hold power over what remained. And as the first stars blinked into view, Sylvia smiled, not out of victory, but of release. The calls didn't stop, but Sylvia no longer even glanced at her phone when it buzzed. Each ring was a familiar echo now. Mark, Melissa, sometimes even Vanessa. The voicemails stacked up one after the other, like panicked voices trapped in small glass jars she never planned to open. At first, the messages were clipped and demanding. Mark's voice cracked with disbelief. Mom, you're making a mistake. You're not thinking straight. You can't just sell off everything like this. Melissa followed soon after, her tone brittle with thinly disguised frustration. You've never done anything like this before. Can we please just talk? Work something out? You're still our mother. But when no response came, the tone shifted. Over the following days, their words softened into apologies, into desperate attempts to summon the warmth they had long neglected. Mom, please, Mark whispered in one message, sounding smaller than she'd ever heard him. We miss you. Sophie misses you. We should have done better. I know we should have. Melissa's voice, once so dismissive, wavered with emotion. I've been thinking about all the dinners you used to make, the birthday cakes, the smell of your Sunday roasts. I don't know why we let it slip like this. The regret in their voices might have once broken her. Once, she would have ached for these words, would have clung to them like a lifeline. But now, as she sat in the stillness of her apartment, the weight of their voices slid off her like water over smooth stone. She had shed that skin. Their guilt belonged to them now. Instead of answering, Sylvia opened her laptop. She scrolled through the email confirmation again, non-refundable ticket booked, a 2-week cooking retreat in Italy. She had dreamed of it for years, but always set it aside for someone else's needs. The retreat offered daily classes, visits to local markets, long afternoons in sunlit kitchens, learning rustic Italian dishes from women who, like her, had spent lifetimes feeding others. The deposit had already cleared. The villa overlooked the Say, Tuscan hills. Her passport, untouched for years, was ready. She glanced around her apartment, the small space she now called home. It was not grand, but it was hers. The air smelled of lavender and rosemary, faint scents from her tiny herb. Garden on the balcony. The sunlight through the wide windows made the kitchen glow, where her recipe journal sat open to a fresh page. There were no empty chairs to haunt her here, no waiting for calls that would never come, no watching her meals go untouched while greasy takeout stole the center of her table. Here there was only peace and the quiet excitement of what still lay ahead. The bank accounts were secure, the trust legally sealed, the house already in the final stages of transfer to the new owners. The family she once built her entire world around had panicked too late. They had mistaken her silence for weakness, her giving nature for permanence. They had never imagined a version of her that no longer needed their approval. Her phone buzzed again. Another call from Mark. She watched it vibrate across the table and finally let it go to voicemail like all the others. The screen dimmed, and the apartment returned to stillness. Outside, the afternoon sun sparkled across the skyline as distant church bells chimed. The world was vast and open, not behind her, but ahead. She had given them her entire life, one meal, one birthday, one sacrifice at a time. And when they no longer needed her service, they discarded her like the used plates they once left for her to clear. But she had discovered something they never expected. She wasn't empty without them. She wasn't stranded. She wasn't finished. Sylvia poured herself a small glass of limoncello, lifting it slightly toward the window where the light filtered through like liquid gold. This was not revenge. This was freedom. Tomorrow, she would begin packing. Soon, she would be walking through narrow Italian streets, buying fresh produce from open-air markets, kneading dough under the guidance of women who, like her, understood the quiet language of flour, water, and salt. She would learn again, not for anyone else, but for herself. And while her children scrambled in the distance, tripping over apologies they should have made years ago, she simply let the phone ring, smiled softly, and sipped her drink in the growing afternoon light. The morning sun filtered gently through the narrow cobblestone streets of Florence, casting warm golden light over the bustling farmers' market. Sylvia moved slowly through the rows of colorful stalls, breathing in the mingling aromas of fresh basil, citrus, and warm bread. Vendors called out cheerfully, offering samples of olives and cheeses, while tourists mingled with locals beneath striped awnings. She felt a sense of ease here, not as a visitor desperate to belong, but as someone simply present, unburdened. Her woven basket hung comfortably over her arm, filled with vibrant produce. Eggplants, the color of deep wine, bright red tomatoes, still warm from the morning sun, fragrant bunches of rosemary, and a small jar of smoked paprika she had discovered from a smiling vendor. She paused at a spice stall where glass jars glittered like gemstones in the light, each holding some fragment of flavor and history. The vendor, a woman perhaps a few years younger than Sylvia, watched as she studied the jars with care. "You have a very good eye," the woman said in accented English. "Most tourists just grab whatever looks pretty. You know what you're looking for." Sylvia smiled softly, running her fingers across a jar of crushed fennel seeds. "I've spent a lifetime learning what flavors speak to each other." The woman's eyes lit with recognition. "You are a chef?" Sylvia hesitated, then nodded, not with the old humility that once made her diminish herself, but with quiet pride. "I suppose I am." The vendor handed her a small packet of lavender buds as a gift. "For your next creation." Sylvia thanked her and continued through the market, the breeze gently lifting the ends of her scarf as she walked. She felt light, her body moving with a grace she hadn't known in years. Here, in this new chapter of her life, there were no heavy silences, no empty seats at a table she had once filled for others. Here, her hands still created, but this time not as a duty, but as a gift to herself. That afternoon, she stood at the front of a small sunlit kitchen inside the villa, where the cooking retreat hosted its weekly classes. Around her sat 6 women, all in their 50s and 60s, laughing and sipping wine as they donned aprons and tied back their hair. They had come from different corners of the world, London, Toronto, Sydney, each carrying their own stories of family, of motherhood, of lives spent pouring into others. Sylvia laid out the ingredients with careful attention. Garlic cloves glistening under the light, sprigs of thyme, fresh lemons, and the sourdough starter she had brought from home, carefully protected throughout her travels. The recipe today was one of her own, the rosemary roasted lamb that no one in her family had touched on that birthday so long ago. "This isn't just about following the steps," Sylvia began, her voice steady, warm. "It's about trusting your hands, about knowing that you fed others long enough. Now you can feed yourselves." The women listened, nodding, understanding more than any words could fully express. She guided them through the motions, how to massage the salt into the lamb, how to listen for the perfect sizzle in the pan, how to breathe in the aroma as garlic and rosemary opened under heat. As they worked, stories naturally poured out. Of children raised, marriages weathered, sacrifices made quietly behind kitchen doors. But the mood was not heavy. It was liberating. They were women reclaiming not just recipes, but pieces of themselves long overlooked. One woman from London smiled as she sliced lemons with practiced precision. "I can't remember the last time I cooked something just for the joy of it, not because someone expected it." Another from Toronto laughed. "My kids always said my food was too much. But isn't that what we always were? Too much. Until they wanted something, of course." They all chuckled softly, a shared language of experience that needed no translation. Sylvia watched them, with a calm heart. She was not here to grieve what had been lost, but to honor what remained. In this kitchen, under the warm Italian sun, she was no one's burden, no one's forgotten matriarch. She was simply Sylvia, a woman with stories to tell, skills to share, and a quiet joy that pulsed stronger with each passing day. As the meal finished roasting and the women gathered around the table to taste their creation, the room filled with laughter and clinking glasses. Sylvia raised her wine, her voice clear but soft. "To all of us, to the years we gave and the years we still have." The glasses met with gentle chimes, and for the first time in a long, long while, Sylvia felt entirely full. Not from the meal itself, but from the peace of knowing she had never been the burden they made her feel. She was always the blessing. They had simply forgotten. The apartment in Florence was small, but perfect. The evening light poured through the open balcony doors, bathing the cozy dining nook in a soft amber glow. Outside, the hum of distant conversations and the faint clinking of wine glasses from nearby cafes added a gentle rhythm to the evening. But inside, there was only stillness, not heavy or lonely, but warm, settled hers. Sylvia moved gracefully around the tiny kitchen, her hands steady and sure. The risotto had reached that delicate moment she loved, creamy but not heavy, each grain of arborio rice holding its shape. She had stirred it gently for nearly 40 minutes, adding ladle after ladle of hot broth, the steam rising with each. Addition like small offerings to the air. Fresh parmesan, a touch of lemon zest, and a drizzle of her favorite olive oil finished it perfectly. She plated the dish carefully, the creamy mound gleaming under the kitchen lights. At the small round table by the window, she had already set her place, a single plate, polished silverware, a folded linen napkin. She poured herself a glass of Chianti, the deep red catching the fading sun as she held the stem briefly, savoring. The ritual. Then, with a quiet smile, she struck a match and lit the candle in the center of the table. Its small flame flickered gently, casting soft shadows across the walls. This was not a grand meal to impress anyone, not a hurried dinner, thrown together for convenience, not something ordered in to avoid effort. This was sacred. This was care, for herself, by herself. Every ingredient chosen with thought. Every step done with love, not for approval, not for praise, but because she deserved it. She sat down, taking a deep breath, allowing the scent of the risotto, bright, earthy, and rich, to fill her senses. The first bite was slow, intentional. The creamy rice melted on her tongue, perfectly balanced. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, savoring not just the taste, but the peace that came with it. There were no interruptions. No dismissive chuckles, no quick texts asking for money, no greasy boxes stacked carelessly on the counter, replacing her careful labor. No one rushing past her food with hollow reassurances that it was better this way. This meal belonged to her. Every bite was a quiet celebration of what she had reclaimed, her time, her space, her dignity. She did not feel bitterness tonight. The anger had long since dissolved, leaving behind only clarity. She thought briefly of that birthday, standing in her old kitchen, holding a serving spoon, while the smell of pepperoni and cheap grease drowned out her slow-roasted lamb and garlic mashed potatoes, the sting of being pushed aside by the very people she had nourished for decades. Back then, she had stood frozen in humiliation, gripping that spoon like a fragile shield. Now, she gripped nothing but her wine glass, raising it slowly toward the candle as if toasting her own quiet triumph. "For 40 years I fed them," she whispered softly into the still room. "Now I feed myself." The candle's flame wavered slightly in the soft breeze drifting through the open window, but held steady. She smiled. Her plate emptied slowly, each bite savored, each sip of wine enjoyed. Without hurry, she was not eating to fill space or pass time. She was present, for herself, for her joy, for the life she had finally chosen. The years of service had not been wasted, but they were complete. The giving had ended. The taking had been stopped. What remained was her, whole, steady, free. As the last sliver of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Sylvia sat back in her chair, closing her eyes for a brief moment. No guilt, no ache, no waiting for calls that wouldn't come. Just the soft hum of distant voices outside and the steady beat of her own peace.